much for joining us. I'm Vanessa Teitelbaum. I'm a Senior Director at the Center for Audit Quality, and welcome to our webinar, Artificial Intelligence, AI 101 for Audit Committees. We have a few housekeeping items to remind you about before we kick off and introduce the panelists. There will be 4 polling questions, so those are required, so please answer those. We'll launch the responses. It'll be a great way to engage with you. And then those polling questions are required for you to get your CPE. It does take a few weeks, so don't fret. It's not immediate, but you will. You don't have to do anything other than answering the polling questions, and you'll get your CPE cert in your inbox. And this webinar is also going to be available on our website for replay. If you are listening to this on replay, however, you will not be eligible for CPE credit. In prepping for this session, we, Corey, Richard, and Linda and I have had some really fun and interesting discussions. And so I'm thrilled and delighted that they have made time today to join me. And I know you're going to get a lot out of this, this webinar. So to start with, Corey, could you please start us off and introduce yourself to the group?
Happy to. Thank you, Vanessa. It's great to be here. Hello, everyone. My name is Corey Hrinserick. I work at Microsoft. I've been here 15 years. And for the past 6 years or so, I've led what we call modern finance for our CFO, Amy Hood. And essentially, my job is to help our great people all across different divisions of finance here embrace new technology and use it to help us innovate and transform in a in a rapid fashion, but also obviously while mitigating risk. So it's great to be here. Happy to talk about what we're doing and what we're learning.
Awesome. Linda, can you go next, please?
Sure. Happy to be here today also. I know Vanessa through my participation in the CAQ's Audit Committee Council. Beyond that, I am on the board and the audit committee for TransUnion, and I'm on the board for a private company, Zealous, where I chair the Audit and Compliance Committee. About this time last year, I departed Nielsen Media, where I had served as the CFO for about 3 years, taking the company from public to private during that time period, also during a pandemic, I might add. And that was preceded by about 8 years at American Express, most recently as the deputy CFO.
Fantastic. And to round us out, Richard, please.
Great. Hi, Vanessa, and thank you for including me in this conversation. Very pleased to be with the group today. My name is Richard Jackson. Despite the accent, I am a US audit partner based here in California. I'm just doing a good impersonation with my accent. I'm a client-serving partner, so I'm the lead audit partner on some of our major public companies here in the Bay Area, both in the technology space and also in the life sciences industry. But I also wear another hat within Ernst & Young, really focused on technology and innovation and thinking about how disruptive technologies like AI, which we're going to talk about today, is really impacting our clients' businesses, really challenging and also creating new opportunities for the audit profession as a whole, and really thinking about the interactions with standard setters, policymakers, and the implications to just the broader profession as a whole.
Yeah, we're going to figure it all out in the next 55 minutes. It's fantastic.
Absolutely.
Now, I feel like we have like some cred by having Corey and Richard. Linda, no disrespect to you, but they're on the West Coast, like they're, Silicon Valley, or in Corey's case, Seattle. So Richard, to start us off, let's level set a little bit. We've all heard about AI. It's the buzzword of 2023 or 2024. I suspect most people who've been to a conference have listened to a panel on AI, Gen AI. So can you start us off a little bit to level set? What do we mean by AI broadly? And then we're going to get into Gen AI a little more specifically.
Yeah, absolutely. And it might be a good time for us to tee up one of our slides just to give people a little bit of a visual representation while I make a couple of comments. But, I think, as you say, Vanessa, everyone is probably hard pressed to avoided the subject of AI and generative AI anywhere in the last 15 months. And that's been incredibly exciting. But, and I should give people assurance, we're not going to make this a dry technology-based lecture, but to give a little bit of context, the concept of AI has actually been around for a really long time, as you can see on this graphic. I mean, we're all the way back to the 1940s. And for many organizations, they'll recognize that, where they've started to touch on some of that AI, especially in the last 15 to 20 years, has been around the subjects of automation and intelligent automation in their organizations. So whether it's from the iteration and the dawn of the personal computer and how that came into the workplace, all the way through to just how those computers started to become more sophisticated, more enabled, and have the ability to analyze information and do things. With that came more of the machine learning and deep learning, which was basically how the machine started to learn from itself and those experiences and apply, well, if it works in scenario X, let's apply that logic to scenario Y. And it did that with, and has done that over, especially the last couple of decades, with an increasing degree of autonomy. So people will be familiar with concepts like RPA, robotic processing, automation, as the machines started to work with increasing degrees of autonomy. What came into that, and partly, and we'll come into this, and I think a little bit more detail over the course of this next hour, is this explosion of generative AI. And at the same time, people started hearing about large language models, natural language processing, NLP. So the things that are in that kind of bottom right-hand side of the graphic here. And really, the non-technical interpretation or explanation I'll give of that is what it really started to do was change the way in which the human interacted with the technology. And so very simply, the large language model is just where the technology was trained to understand how humans talk to each other and communicate. And those large language models were trained very simplistically off of the internet, where they were pointed at that repository of all that public information and told, go and understand how humans interact, why the language they use, the context within that language occurs. That then was combined with this ability of this natural language processing. That means that now the computer starts to, so when I start to talk, have the ability to talk to the machine, and whether that's verbally through, voice recognition, or whether it's just the way in which I type in instructions to the computer, the fact that it starts to understand my normal language and can translate my language into computer coding, computer terminology, it suddenly opened up Pandora's box, because now the domain of how you interact with the computer is no longer within the confines of someone that understands programming language and knows exactly what you've got to tell the computer to make it perform in a certain way. Now, anyone like me, an untrained professional, can interact with the machine. At the same time, you started to get this concept called generative AI, which again, we'll come back to in a few moments, where the technology starts to not just interpret existing information, but it actually starts to have the ability to create new content. And so you take that confluence of all those things coming together, and that's where people started to hear about OpenAI when it released GPT 3.5 back in November of 22. It was closely followed up by 4.0, which was a version release that came in March of 23. And all of that came together in that window of time that captured people's consciousness and started to spark all this energy and excitement and saying, okay, if all of a sudden, all of this capability no longer has to reside in the IT organization, but is actually accessible to all of us, even to the point where these technologies were put out free for use on the internet so everyone could access them, everyone started getting excited and seeing the capabilities and the opportunities. So that's why we're talking about it. That's why it's been inescapable for the last 12, 15 months. And again, I think as we'll explore today, there's both been an explosion of excitement around the opportunities it creates, as well as a growing realization of some of the risks and challenges and the unique aspects of how that proliferation of technology comes to bear for a lot of organizations.
Thank you. And I think we're going to have, one of the things we're going to really focus on today is providing some examples in addition to, certainly focusing on the audit committee oversight or board oversight. So, but that, that's hopefully for the audience a good background. Do we want to move to the second slide?
Yeah, and perhaps Vanessa, just to jump in on that, because I think to try and bring that live, there's a couple of points on here that obviously talk about, that timeline that I described with ChatGPT. But some of the use cases or some of the examples that people probably heard a lot was the idea of how the technology was taking exams, right? We'll come back to this, and obviously I'm a CPA, so we took great pride in the fact that, you know, when the technology started being pointed at the exam boards, it passed the bar exam much earlier than it passed the CPA exam. We like to think that's more a function of just the rigor of the finance industry as opposed to our legal brethren, but obviously I'm joking a little bit. But what we saw through even just the iteration of moving from 3.5 to 4.0 was it was that leapfrogging in terms of how the technology was able to understand that natural language, to understand what was, you know, the human language interface, but it was also able to teach itself and create the content in a much better way even in that 4-month movement between 3.5 being introduced and 4.0 coming out. It also meant that when it took those exams, not only did it pass the exams, it started to surpass the human capability. It wasn't just creeping over the hurdle of, you know, a 75% pass rate. It was leapfrogging what the average human response and success in that was. And it started to give that glimpse as to what could the technology do now when it gets pointed at the right use cases. And again, I think we'll move on in a moment to try and illustrate a little bit of what organizations are actually doing as they try and point this capability now at the specific examples and where it can be applied best, especially in the corporate world.
Thanks. I know we'll talk about the interaction and the important need for humans to still be involved. But I think there's, you know, creates, as you're saying, a lot of exciting opportunity and risk, but certainly opportunity. So if we go to the slide 3, I think, Corey, you can help us understand better how AI is being used.
Yeah, thank you. And first of all, thank you to Richard. That was absolutely a masterclass in AI in just a couple minutes. So Richard, well done. That was awesome. I think I'd love to get this recording and share it with our finance people later. We're still learning ourselves. And this is a great slide. I think another EY slide, and I can just kind of talk to it. Where is AI being used? Everywhere, right? Our goal is to embed AI into every process within Microsoft Finance. And there are literally opportunities in every single function, in every single team. And we could talk about it from, you know, these things that you see on the slide. I think it can do all these things. Obviously, it can summarize information. That's a big one that generative AI can do out of the gate. It can generate content, as Richard mentioned. It can give us insights from our data. You know, AI, broadly speaking, is really good at forecasting and estimations. Can help us look at policies and things like that. So we can expand more on these, but just to give you some practical examples, we've been incorporating AI into processes at Microsoft for about 7 or 8 years now. And so obviously long before kind of generative AI or large language models were really mainstream like they are in the past 12 to 15 months or so. And so what does that mean? Like, we've been using these traditional AI or analytical AI approaches like machine learning that Richard alluded to. And so we started with forecasting. AI is really good at understanding patterns in data, and especially time series information. And we will continue to invest in these analytical AI models where we train these machine learning models to absolutely kind of help us forecast our business performance. We've been using it in risk management and compliance. AI is very good at spotting anomalies between different things, or helping us reconcile. You think about how many reconciliations we do in any finance function. AI for a long time has been able to do those reconciliations, to look at certain data from different systems and try to help us find those patterns. We use it for risk scoring. And so if we can take, say, an invoice or a document or a contract, and or even an expense report from an employee, we can use AI to train a risk score. And then if we can find things that are low risk, then we can automate those things, as Richard mentioned. Then we have kind of that AI-driven automation. So those are things that we've done just kind of on the traditional front. Now with generative AI over the past year, as Richard said, it's really about creating this natural language interface on top of everything that we do. It just is so good at understanding the user intent and also giving us answers in a way that seems coherent and like just seems intelligent, right? So we can actually plop it right into a report. So it's very good at synthesizing inputs from multiple different places. Now, the trick is combining generative AI with other technology behind the scenes to help us do that. But just to give you a couple of specific use cases for Gen AI for us so far, we're using it in the collection space to understand all the information from our customers. What are they saying? What are their concerns about paying their bill? And then how do we respond to them very quickly, right? And summarize that information. It's summarizing all of our policies and creating a knowledge-based system that anybody can query across the company and can get very detailed answers, right? It's about looking at contracts or proposals from vendors and understanding maybe language that we may want to drill into, so that you don't have to really like perhaps read every contract and every word to get at least a sense of what they're proposing. And you can get a very high level sense very quickly, and it helps you get answers faster. So just to give you a few concrete examples of how we're using AI, it's literally going to change the way that we work in finance. It's so exciting.
Thanks. And I know when we were prepping for this and you were describing that, that on top, how a generative AI, for collections, for example, can summarize, those emails from a customer, and it just brought it to life so much, because we always hear AI can do this, AI can do that. So really interesting to think of that opportunity. Linda, speaking of that, from a your experience, both finance and now on the audit committee, I'm curious, how do you describe AI? Like, what does AI mean to you? What do you think of when you hear AI?
AI is just so incredibly pervasive, and I think we're all experiencing it during the course of any 2-hour period, 24-hour period, certainly in our personal lives. What I think is really fascinating right now, though, is the professional perspective of it. And I really view generative AI as the next step on a change journey or a transformation journey. And if I just think about how companies remain competitive and how employers remain competitive, I do think that what we're seeing emerge right now is that generative AI is part of the competitive advantage. It's a part of what new employees will expect when they're evaluating career opportunities. They're really going to expect that those companies who are focused on remaining relevant are going to have embraced it, will have a program for it that they can see themselves fitting into. And then Gen AI is just so readily available at this point in time. And that's where I think it will really make it a human competitive advantage. I don't think companies that have not embraced it or don't have it as a part of their strategy are going to be viewed as favorably.
Great. And I want to encourage anyone who has questions as we're talking about this, the terminology, questions that you have, feel free to put it in the Q&A, and we'll try to respond. So let's go to our first polling question. It's very basic. Have you experimented with ChatGPT? We're just curious. Is this a no-brainer? Everybody has. Nobody has. We'll give that a few minutes. So that's the polling question for you to answer. Necessary for CPE. While you do that, we're going to keep discussing, and then we'll pull up the results. So we've already moved from talking about AI broadly, which Richard gave a great overview about, and we've talked about generative AI. Maybe, Corey, if I can, I know you started talking about the use cases, but can you talk about, maybe follow up more a little bit about generative AI in finance? Why is generative AI, we think about finance as being numbers, and AI as being text. So how is that relevant for finance?
Yeah, that's a good distinction. And it is important to kind of call out for finance. And frankly, it's still evolving so fast, right? So I think as I mentioned, we've been using this more traditional or analytical AI for a long time, and will continue to. Just because generative AI has come along doesn't mean that it negates all the investment that we've made or that companies have made into traditional machine learning approaches. I think for finance and for numerical calculations, that's probably still the best technology to use in most cases. Generative AI right now is absolutely, bar none, the best large language model that we can all tap into. And most companies, AI in general, I think, Richard, you said this, but AI depends on enormous amounts of data. Why is AI useful? It's because it can understand and synthesize much more data than any of us can do in our brains, right? It can just ingest a ton of information. And so that's why traditional AI and analytical AI is very helpful, because we can actually plug in numbers, enormous amounts of numerical data, and it can help us spot patterns and trends and really help us kind of, do these things like forecasting and other things. Generative AI or large language models aren't trained to do that. And so people, a lot of times there's this kind of misunderstanding right now that ChatGPT or generative AI, broadly speaking, should be able to do all of these, reason over this information and logic and help us, come up with the next strategic decision for our company. It really isn't trained to do that. If you kind of go back to what Richard said at the top of the call, these large language models have been trained not on your data, but on enormous quantities of data out in the universe. And so you think about it, that's why it's so good at language, right? And so then the key is passing a prompt from a user kind of through to the large language model, and then using what's called RAG, or retrieval augmented generation, to grab some information from, say, for example, the Microsoft Graph, and then passing that back to the user in a way that sounds intelligible, right? That's what it's really good at doing. And so we'll just use it for those kinds of things. It's another, we think about it as one more tool in the toolkit, right? Like it's a great new power tool for all those people who love power tools. It's awesome, but it can't do everything, right? Just because you have that fancy new saw, you can't go taking that saw to every single problem in your workshop, or you're going to have a lot of mess. So, we're going to combine it in thoughtful ways with a lot of other technology to do whatever we want to do. So for us, we identify a problem or an opportunity in our finance division and process, perhaps, that needs to be streamlined. And then we ask ourselves, how can we do that? And usually there's a few steps. Usually we need to grab data and pull that together in one spot. Typically, we also want to stand up great reporting on top of that data. You don't even need AI to do that, right? Like we use tools like Power BI and other things to just get a sense of what's going on. Then we can start training AI models on top of that. If it's numerical, we may train traditional ML models. If we need a language interface for users to be able to kind of interact with it, then that's where generative AI could come in. Or if we're dealing with text-based information, then again, these generative AI models are awesome at doing that. And then we may also want to do some automation, as Richard mentioned before. We may want to, at some point, we may even want to have a bot or something else sitting on top of it. So, so that's kind of how we would approach this generative AI movement and incorporating that in anything that we do. There's probably no solution that we build right now that is 100% generative AI. It's generative AI in concert with other technology.
Yeah, and perhaps Vanessa, can I jump in just because I want to build on a couple of things Corey said, because I think it was absolutely spot on. I often describe to people, one of the interesting things we've got is that we've created this expectation of the perfection of the AI and the generative AI in such a short time space that we almost get disappointed when it's not a perfect answer. And we almost forget that we've only had this technology or this tool available for the last 12, 15 months. And I often tell my colleagues and my clients that, at the moment, if you just go and use the base technology, it's equivalent of asking for marital advice from the internet. Be careful what you get back. You need to train it in the way that Corey described. And so, for example, whether it's in finance organizations or even within Ernst & Young, one of the things we're doing is we're taking that capability of the generative AI, but now we're having to train it and point it at our subject matter specific. So accounting and auditing guidelines, for example, where you now take its ability to understand human context and human language, but you point it and train it within the specific context of how you want to apply it. That's when you start to be able to now do things like better inquiries of all of the accounting and audit guidance that exists, whether it's US GAAP or IFRS, for example. You start to be able to couple that with the generative AI to say, give me a summary of the revenue recognition rules, for example. And with the appropriate amount of training, it can start to give you those crisp summaries and that's the generative part of this whole equation. It starts to help summarize and interpret information for you. And we're starting to see organizations take that thinking and now apply it to say, well, can it help write technical accounting positions based upon the particular industry or the sector within which an organization exists, because it has been trained and has the context against which it should create content. It could go as far as we've got some organizations we're working with where they're starting to think about how can the generative AI help draft the financial statements and the exhaustive footnote disclosures that we all know and deal with through our day jobs. It starts to open up that Pandora's box. But to do that, you have to do what Corey described, which is you have to understand it is another tool in the box, an incredibly powerful and exciting tool, but it needs to be used in the right context, the right way. And it does need a degree of training, both technical and just context to help extract the value out of that tool.
Yeah, and tell me if I'm not thinking about this the right way, but as you're saying that, like, just to date myself, right? I mean, there was a time when accountants or lawyers might, had a library of books behind them, right? And we didn't know where to go. I'm not so old that my kids think I'm old, but like I have lived in the computer world my entire career, but right, there was a time generations ahead of me, right? It wasn't even computer based. So like what I hear you saying is, this is like now a super brain that's able to search all of that material that used to sit in, books, reference books, but now it's a million other places and it's electronic. I know that's oversimplifying it, but that's kind of the way I'm hearing what you're saying.
No, that's absolutely right. I want to come back to one of the things that Linda said, because I think it was incredibly insightful, which is at the moment, when people learn about this and they start to think about the opportunity, our brains intuitively go to efficiency and the ability to do things faster, quicker, and to take cost out of the equation. Absolutely, that is very much the kind of one of the near-term benefits of this technology. But I think organizations are also increasingly starting to focus on the ability for it to become a competitive advantage. And Linda talked about, from the board's perspective, how do you start to think about not just the ability to take out cost from the organization and do things better, do them quicker, and to a better quality, because that's absolutely part of what the machine side of things does. But it also starts to be an opportunity for organizations to differentiate their products and their services relative to how they really embed this capability in their market-facing activities as well.
Good. And I almost forgot, we need to launch our results. So maybe if we can do the polling results now. So 70% have experimented, 29% no, or 30%. So most folks have some familiarity with it. So that's great. We've gotten a number of questions in Q&A, but first, Linda, let me ask you, in your experience as a CFO, have your teams used generative AI or other transformative technologies?
Sure. So the short answer on generative AI would be no, but that was largely because how quickly it has come to market and been embraced. And as I mentioned, I was leaving Nielsen about this time last year. But if I think more broadly about what my teams have done, sure, any good CFO or finance leader needs to always be transforming and creating capacity by finding efficiencies, as Richard alluded to. And so some of my experience is very similar to what Corey has described. And it's largely just because my leadership style is to lead with change and innovation as core principles. So if I think about some of the specific tools that we've used in the past, RPA or robotics, and we most often use that when we needed to bridge the gap between two systems that weren't otherwise connected. And it does a really nice job with that. We had experimented a little bit with natural language processing as well, mostly just to translate what you refer to, Vanessa, as numbers into words. So the NLPs know things, they have things in their vocabulary like increase, decrease, due to an invoice that was processed on. And so they're very primitive insights, but they're based on black and white underlying data. And then probably the most powerful work that my teams had done in the past was in the data programming language space using tools such as Python, largely to, let's say, process or stratify or even visualize extremely large volumes of data. And those tools are really, really good at that. I think what's different with Gen AI, and you've heard it already in this hour, is that with Gen AI, there are judgments being exercised. There is comprehension, there is understanding based on the boundaries of what those tools have been trained on. And that's where some really important guardrails come in that we'll be talking about a little bit later on. Because to the example that you use, Vanessa, analyzing tons of accounting literature, well, that's all great and fine, as long as it's being pointed and it's leveraging the right literature, from the right domains. Is it US, is it IFRS, or is it a market where there's local country accounting that needs to be used? And so you've got to put those boundaries and guardrails around it from a learning perspective, or you'll end up with the wrong judgments being exercised.
And I'm jumping ahead because I know we talked about this in prep, but like that's where there is, there's still right now, especially, but I think we all agree, a need for human oversight. This is not, completely relying on AI. And from what I understand, I'm the non-techie here, so I probably shouldn't get too far ahead of myself. But like I've thought of it, I've heard generative AI, predict based on, that's why there's that example of a legal brief where a Gen AI supposedly had a fictitious case because it predicted that's what would happen, but it wasn't actually a real case. So we can come back to this, the hallucinations, that kind of thing. Corey, I'm going to jump to a question, which is, I'm curious from Corey's perspective, what is the best place to practically start the AI journey? And I know that's at least I think it's a broad question, but I guess I wonder, as I hear you talk about AI can do this, AI can do that. Like, I don't know for our listeners, if you're not familiar with AI, like, what does that mean? Because before computers existed and Microsoft Word existed and somebody was talking about word processing and I'd always used a typewriter, I might have a hard time understanding, what do we mean a word processor can do this, if I'd never sat in front of it? So what do we mean by, do you know what I mean? Like the tools, where does somebody start? Yeah.
It's such a great question. And honestly, everyone's asking, and even at Microsoft, right? Like we've had pockets where for a long time, we've had these pockets where we've really gone deep in AI, and there's other areas where it's been surface level until now. And now every leader is asking, how do I adopt AI in my org? How do I push this? And I think it starts with what Linda said. I love, Linda, how you just say, hey, like I lead from the front. I'm a strategic CFO, right? I think for us, having our CFO, Amy, she's been CFO now for a decade. And 8 years ago, it was at her request that we start using AI. And so that tone at the top is absolutely the first place to start, because people perceive risk whenever you introduce new technology, right? And so having a leader say, hey, it's okay, we're going to give you space to try this. It may not all work 100%, but we need to do this, and let's go along on this journey, which is exactly what Amy said, and it sounds like exactly what Linda's been saying. That is absolutely one of the first places. Second place to start, I think, for people, now if you start at the top, and then obviously start from the grassroots. And for us, it's learning. The more that our people embrace a growth mindset and that they just realize, hey, I don't know how to do this yet, but I think there's a huge opportunity here. We several years ago as well, we launched these learning paths in Microsoft Finance. And at the time, we launched 3 data analytics paths, and we launched, I think, 6 data science paths to kind of go through beginner, intermediate, and advanced. And that was maybe 5 years ago. And so people through our organization have been going through this journey. And the more that they learn, the potent combination is when you can take a subject matter expert, like somebody in tax or audit, internal audit or accounting, and you give them a little bit of education about AI and what it can do and what it can't do, and how to think about bringing data. then it sparks these ideas in people's brains, and they say, wow, like I could use it for this thing. So I think that's step number 2. Then step number 3, you'll probably want to start fostering this grassroots AI innovation. And the best thing about, I think, some of the things that are happening now is that AI is becoming democratized, right? To use that word that I'm sure is probably overused, but things like Copilot that we announced, and I think a lot of other companies are democratizing this AI. That's definitely kind of maybe a third step. And I think the goal is just to encourage people to use that tech, get familiar with what it can do, push it to its limits, because it's something that, frankly, everybody can do with very little training and education. And then I think fourth, maybe, and I'll end here, is probably, what we're doing, for example. We've been on the journey a while. We've experimented. We've adopted a growth mindset. We've started building some things. At some point, you need to step back and ask yourself, kind of, what are the strategic opportunities for AI now? But for us, we didn't do that straight out of the gate. I think, and maybe that's just because of Amy's style, and she wanted to bring her org along on the journey. But we got to a point a few years ago where we could start stepping back and reassessing every process. And now with trained and kind of knowledgeable finance people, we could start being much more strategic in where we were going to go, and work with engineering or our IT organization, maybe bring in great vendors, great third-party experts who could help us build out these things in a more strategic way. So anyway, that would be maybe my 4-step process. Starts with the top, then you go to grassroots and learning, then you start fostering this innovation, and then you take a quick step back and figure out where you're going to embed AI in a strategic manner. I think if we were starting today, we'd probably do something like that. And you could do it as fast as you can. You could probably start doing some of those things in parallel, but there's a little bit of a sequence there. Is that helpful?
Vanessa, can I link what Corey said? Because this is completely unrehearsed, so let's see if this works. But I loved your reference. I loved your reference to the word processor, and I think we're all old enough to remember that word. But I think to make what Corey underscore what Corey said, part of it you have to ground it in where is the level of automation and the digital transformation within the process. So if you think about your word processor example, you probably sat there back in the day going, wouldn't it be great if there was some way that instead of me using my typewriter and every time I make a mistake, I have to use whiteout to correct for it. And then along came the word processor that gave you a screen that helped you automate that activity in a way that it moved the dial forwards. And then over time, at the time, you never imagined that the word processor would be able to start telling you when you made spelling mistakes. But then there came this thing called auto check. And the first versions of it, you actually had to go in and say, please go back and check it. Now, the technology actually tells you real time, I think you spelled that wrong based on the context of what I understand you're saying. We now get to the point where you don't even need to use a keyboard to write that. You could use voice recognition and the ability to interact with the machine in a way that it understands what you're trying to say. And the last piece of this puzzle is generative AI and the natural language. You can now actually, you don't even have to give it word for word. You could now just say, I want to write a paper that talks about these following subjects. Can you turn that into an example for me? So when you look at that example, it's taken us 25 years to get there, but you had that level of automation and an increase in sophistication to the automation that was occurring. And along the way, you started to inject intelligence into it and increasing amounts of autonomy. If you take that example,
Richard, yeah.
All we're talking about now is doing all of that, but doing it in a matter of weeks and months, as opposed to over the duration of 2 to 3 decades.
Richard, I experienced that just yesterday. I was doing a LinkedIn post and linking to a piece that somebody had recently written. And I started drafting up, my preamble before I hit the post button. And LinkedIn asked me, did they want to take a stab at improving the wording in my post? And I said, what the hell? Might as well, because I'm on the eve of doing this AI session. And what I will say is I pretty much went with the rewrite, and I found that it had more energy than the way I was about to write it. So it was great. There was a great outcome.
So every time I'm using, and I'll give a plug for Microsoft, which is independent because we just happen to use it, like Teams. Well, somebody will send you something, and my brain wants to be like, oh, fine, but the auto response will be like, great, and I'm like, oh, that's better. but
Yeah.
I don't
Totally.
know if that's AI, generative AI. I don't know what to call that
No,
automated.
but I think it's a great example, and Linda, you're spot on, because I think, and at the moment, the human is still, when we talk about the human in the loop, you still are making that decision of, do I want to go with that, yes or no? Do I want to edit
Right.
it? But over time, you can imagine, as you just said, you look at it and go, well, that's actually even better than I would have done myself. And it goes to that increasing amount of autonomy that we will inherently give to the machine as we get more and more comfortable with its competence and its proficiency in this space.
And I do want to make sure we get our polling questions out. So the next polling question, which I'm going to launch, well, the question is, before we launch it, the question is, does your company have I'm going to call it a closed ChatGPT? And I said like Chat PwC. I know we don't have PwC here, but I've heard firms that I work with say they have a Chat PwC, Chat BDO. I don't know if EY calls it Chat EY or something, but it's closed as opposed to like OpenAI. So can I ask Corey maybe to just explain, in case people aren't familiar with that, like the difference between, again, 70% of you have experimented with ChatGPT, which is open, correct? Like, and maybe talk about closed, and then we'll launch the polling question, and we'll also cruise through the other polling questions.
Yeah, it's a great distinction. I think it's, obviously ChatGPT revolutionized, this kind of moment right now where it just captured the attention of everybody. Millions of users, right, downloaded it, which is great. It sounds like 70% of you as well. The distinction, I mean, for us, we discourage anybody using these kind of open generative AI models for business context, right? Like, because as soon as you put a prompt into a system, that prompt at least is going to a third party. And so there have been many cases about companies getting into trouble with putting strategic or competitive information into those prompts, and then all of a sudden that sits on a third-party server. So instead, as you alluded to, Vanessa, some people are calling it this more closed system versus open, which is something like, I mean, I'll speak from our perspective. We encourage all of our people, if you want to use the power of something like ChatGPT, use Bing Chat Enterprise. The distinction there is that Bing Chat Enterprise sits on our own Microsoft tenant. And so those prompts never leave our firewall, right? Like they stay there. We can actually make sure that we contain all of that. We're deploying kind of that mini instance of ChatGPT internally on a local server. Think about it like that.
Thank you. So let's launch the polling question. Sorry.
No, go ahead. That's perfect.
So does your company have a closed ChatGPT? We'll launch the answers in a minute. And in the interest of time, this has been a great conversation, but we have a lot more planned to cover. Richard, we've talked a decent amount about use cases, but maybe you can, well, I'm trying to think if we have time. I really want to get to the risk question. So let's actually, I'm going to move us along. There is a question, which Richard, I'm going to pose this to you. As audit compliance or risk professionals, where are the primary or most important concerns or risk areas that need to be considered before adding an AI/Gen AI tool for your firm's use? I know I'm jumping ahead. Well, that's pretty much.
No, yeah, I think we can jump into this, and I'm going to watch Linda's face, because I know this is going to probably light up and resonate with a lot of her focus from the board as well, which I think we'll want to cover. But I think in the first instance, it is about, and it picks up what Corey just described, which is, in the first instance, how is this technology being used and deployed within organizations? And one of the very simple questions we often ask our clients and organizations is, do you know where the AI is currently being used? Really simple question, but it goes to the heart of, did you just tell everyone they could use any form of the technology? Do you know if they're using the public versions of it? Do you know if they're using a closed? Is there even a closed version, as Corey just described, this in-house enterprise version of this technology that sits within your firewalls on your domains that you control? Do you understand how you've used it and provisioned access to your employee base for that? Do you understand how any of your vendors or your service providers are doing similar? Because you may be dependent upon their activities as well. Then once you kind of get just the inventory of the use case, do you understand the significance of it? Is it just being used for a bunch of people to go and play and think about it? or have parts of the business already started to embed it organically into their processes and their systems and controls? Do you understand what data it's consuming and how that data is being protected? How does it satisfy your existing obligations under all the various data privacy laws that we all know about? What about the confidentiality of client information? As you can imagine, within professional services, we have access to large volumes of our clients' data, and it's very important to us that we protect and preserve the confidentiality of that information between clients. So how is that being managed within the organization? Comes back to, and I know we're going to talk a little bit about the regulatory environment in a moment, but there's a lot of focus from policymakers around these questions of, are organizations consciously doing this? Are they inventorizing it? Do they understand it? Do they assess the impacts of it? And then how are they building governance and control around it and accountability within an organization?
Sorry. Yep. Thank you. So let's launch the responses from the second polling question. So many, 41% do have closed chat. So, and now if we can launch our third polling question, just want to make sure we get the CP in. And the third polling question is, do you use AI in your work on a regular basis? So we asked if you experiment with ChatGPT. Now we want to know a little bit more, is it used on a regular basis? While we're doing that, and thank you, Richard. Linda, can you talk a little bit more about the risks that Richard was talking about, in the sense of what risks are you concerned about from an audit committee perspective?
Yeah, and I think, look, I'll couple some of what we just heard from Corey as well as some of what we just heard from Richard, because Richard was talking about a lot of the controls. I think it's not a coincidence that the theme over in Davos this week is trust. I think it's squarely at the intersection of AI. And I think that's really a focus area, is how do we ensure that the tremendous power of AI is going to have all of the right boundaries on it. And to a certain extent, I think companies are finding it's through using a closed environment, because with that, they're able to define the data that is used by the generative AI tool for its learnings. And companies want to limit their risk, especially if they're going to get to the point of developing a product that leverages the company's internal data. Those boundaries are helpful, and it will help manage the risk. If I just, reflect on how all of this has been coming about, I'll circle back to what Corey said earlier. It's about tone at the top. And how is management within a company setting the tone, developing the strategy? How is that strategy then being executed on? And, from my vantage point, or whatever committee of the board that might be tasked with this particular area, I think by default we're finding largely it's full boards, but the responsibility is to oversee the process. To oversee that process, management has to get ahead of it and have it developed into the strategy. If I think about generative AI, it's, as I said, it's the next step in change management, in transformation, a very dynamic and impactful step, but it's a next step. And so what it's largely doing is what we have used humans to do in the past. So you can, at the simplest form, think that if we think about it from a risk perspective and the risks that the board wants to ensure are being appropriately managed, reputational risk is top of mind. But that's the case in human processes as well, is the board is very focused on the reputational risk of the company. So you can really think about a framework that can be used for human processes. What is the project management? How is the tool being deployed? By whom and when? What is the human intervention, the supervision and review that is being brought to bear to look at the output of the tools? No different than if a human had done the processing. Earlier, either Richard or Corey referenced the fact that this, I think it was Richard, used to always sit in the IT organization. And by design, that in and of itself was a control. Now it's been, Corey, democratized, and it's being put in the hands of so many employees within organizations that in and of itself increases the risk. So I think we will see boards and committees calibrating the risk appetite and then ensuring that there are the right controls that are being brought to bear to manage some of these risks that we've seen in the past, but then some of the risks that are new. You referenced hallucinations, bias that can be present in the models, and ensuring that the right skills and talent are on board in order to manage those risks. So focusing all of this to manage the enterprise risk is super important. Top of mind for me is really that reputational risk.
Great. Can we launch, please, the results of that last polling question? And while that's going, we have a lot of great questions. So 20% using it regularly in their work. I don't know, Corey, if that surprises you, or Richard, or Linda.
It doesn't terribly surprise me, I would say. I've met with a few CFOs over the years, and it feels like people are always a little reluctant to jump in. I think now, it's just becoming so approachable, honestly, AI now. So I think that those numbers will change. It'll be interesting to see what that looks like a year from now. Because I think, to something Linda said a minute ago too, I just think it is this huge strategic opportunity. People are going to be left out. It's going to, Linda mentioned at the top of the call, even, new employees are looking for these kinds of experiences. They want to come into a finance organization that's embracing these new technologies and can enable them to learn and to develop these skills. So I think we'll see a massive adoption of AI over the next year or two.
The word of caution or optimism, whichever way you want to look at that, I might say is it does go a little bit back to how well do we know where it's being used? Because, as I walk the halls of my clients, even amongst their own organizations, a number of times I hear people say, well, I did that, but I also looked it up on, I also used the tool to verify, to corroborate. And I think that's part of the challenge. And I know we'll try and talk a little bit about regulation as well. But that first point is, do people even understand that because it is so democratized, because it is now in the hands of everyone, does that mean that all the uses of it are being surfaced through those traditional mechanisms in the way that people have traditionally looked at to understand the deployment of technology?
Yeah. And I'm sensitive to time. There's so much more we could talk about, and there's a lot of great questions, which we will not be able to get to today. We will read them and assess how we could potentially respond in another manner. But in order to, again, the CPE credit, the two topics I want to make sure we do cover briefly. And so, Richard, let's start with you. I know we can. This is a hard question to answer in just a few minutes, but you mentioned regulations, and there is a question about auditability. In the absence of any auditing education experience, can an individual nonetheless perform an audit using AI? That's one question. But we've also asked, how does an auditor think about auditing AI? So can you talk a little bit about that briefly, maybe a little bit of regulation? And then I want to go to Linda about questions to ask audit committees, which I know is another broad topic, before we wrap up.
Yeah, I'll try and be quick. I think that the headline answer is that there is a lot of work we can do today within the audit industry and the profession to understand and assess it, but there's a lot of work that still needs to be done, especially from a methodology, the standard setters and the policymakers around how do we, all of those things need to catch up with the pace of technology, to be perfectly candid.
Right.
But what we are doing today is, and I'm going to go back to one of the things Linda said, is when you think about this technology and analogize it to the human behavior, you can start to break it down and say, well, first of all, do I know where it's being used? Do I then also understand what data it is accessing? Do I understand who was in control of its use and deployment? Do I understand where a human has been put in the quality control mechanism? Go back to Linda's LinkedIn example of, is there someone looking at the recommended output and saying, oh, yes or no, that satisfies the requirement? Those are all things we can look at today. And we'll look at it through frameworks, guidance, policies, and structures to understand how well that's being managed, deployed, and controlled within organizations, and we can audit that. There is this piece at the heart of the technology of how the algorithm works, and that black box concept of, you've mentioned it a couple of times, that, without going down the rabbit hole of explaining the predictability concept of the algorithm, there is still a lot of work that needs to be done on that. That's not unique to the profession. That's actually, that's one of the things that the developers of this technology themselves are often still surprised by, or still trying to get their heads around of how and why does it work quite in the way it does. And that gives rise to all these things like hallucinations and everything that we're not going to have time to dive in today. So the short answer to all of this is you break it down in terms of the questions of where has it been deployed, how has it been deployed, who designed it, with what intent, and where does the human sit within that proliferation of use. Those are the things that we know how to audit today. We know how to build accountability and governance and controls and process around.
So let's launch our last polling question, which is whether or not has the audit committee of your company discussed AI in the past 12 months? Just, has it been on the agenda? While that's being done, Richard, maybe 30 seconds. I know. Can you talk about regulatory environment for AI?
I can, and you can start the clock. See if I can do it in 30 seconds. I would put it in the broad context of this we're seeing two broad spectrums of regulation going on, and think of them almost as bookends. I'll start here in the US. We saw the President Biden's executive order in the late fall of 23, which was really setting out a voluntary-based program of standards and expectations, principally pointed at government and federal agencies and vendors, but really sending a signal out to the broader community of what is the expectations of what organizations should hold themselves accountable to, but still very much a set of guidelines and more voluntary in nature. On the opposite end of the bookshelf, we've got more directive compliance obligations coming out of Europe with the passage of the AI Act. And so there you're seeing, there was a political agreement right before the holidays with an enactment coming out over the course of 25 and 26, where it gets much more directed through the rule of law and through the mechanisms of fines and penalties, whereby there are very much clearer and prescribed boundaries. And then in between of those bookends, I think you've got a spectrum of what I'll say, directives, agreements, accords, everything that we've seen and read about in the press, whether it's coming out of the G7 summits, the OECD, as well as things like the Bletchley Accord, which was the big agreement that came out of a UK-based summit, again, right before the holidays. So the key message here is that's going to continue to evolve. I think we're going to see combinations of both governmental, federal, international, as well as here in the US, state-level legislation that's just it's something organizations are going to have to watch, they're going to have to adapt to, and it will continue to evolve as some of the questions and the risks associated with this become more pronounced.
Great. Can we launch our polling results for that last polling question? So 35% said yes. And then again, in a minute or two, Linda, what do you think are some high-level questions that folks should be thinking about, that audit committees should be asking? And then we'll do lightning round.
Sure. I would answer it, audit committees and the board, but I'll go back to and just be a bit repetitive. How's the company embracing generative AI and their overall business strategy? Is it internal or is it more commercial facing? However it is, how is the company balancing those opportunities with the inherent risks? And that's what is really, really important for board level discussions, in my opinion. You heard Richard speaking to some of the regulatory risks. And, if it's a US based company, you've got to think global because jurisdictions do matter. I think one of the things for companies to be thinking about is it a centralized model for rollout, or is it more of a federated model? Because the latter will introduce a bit more risk. And then Richard touched on this earlier too, but the other area I would just draw attention to, because it is super important, is for those companies that have a dependence on third parties, and a lot of companies do these days, how are they implementing AI? What are the boundaries, the guardrails they have around usage and data, and what are the implications to our company, so to speak? I think those are a couple of areas that can be really important for committees and boards to be thinking about.
Thanks. So lightning round, Corey, I'll start with you. Can you give our audience your key takeaway, then Richard, then Linda? Yeah.
So I mean, we got no time, I think. So key takeaways are: embrace AI. It is absolutely going to change the future of your organizations. You have to do it planfully and thoughtfully. Folks like audit committees can do a great job asking the right questions giving people space, but also making sure that there are controls in place to ensure that this technology is implemented in a safe and secure way, but also while supporting a strategic vision for your organization.
Great. Richard?
You've heard me use analogies a few times. I'll use a very simple one, that of a car. The better your braking system is on a car, the faster you can go. So the speed at which you want to evolve, innovate, and maximize the opportunities of this has to be predicated or influenced by the speed of the quality of the braking system, and that's all around controls, process, and governance.
I love that. Linda, last word.
I'll pull those two together and I'll say either embrace it or be left out. And it's moving quickly, and so you really have to embrace it, or you definitely will be losing out. It'll be fascinating, Vanessa, to see if we re-adjourn this same group a year from now. It would be a lot different, a lot more tangible examples. It's just moving extremely quickly.
Yeah. Well, since I have the mic now, I'll say the real last word, which is one, thank you all so much. I think the more I hear and learn from you all, the more it makes you realize we couldn't cover a lot of basics even today. And so, but there's a lot of great information out there. There are a lot of podcasts, there's a lot of webinars, there's a lot of panels, there's a lot of white papers. And so I think we all have to take it upon ourselves, if we are not experts in this area, to do our own learning, as you were saying, Corey. But I want to say thank you for joining us. Thank you to the panelists. This was really fun. And Linda, maybe we will get the band back together in a year or another time. So stay tuned for our next episode of this webinar. And thanks everyone for having it, and have a great day.